something we talked about on Friday's show, John, which was let's try to run the ball. Even if you can't run the ball, maybe it opens some things up later, and they got away from that as well. And then the game just kind of fell apart. I mean, they just unraveled on the illegal formation play that gets called back. They then have a drop on the next play, and it just seemed to completely spiral out of control. I don't know that there's an irrational reason why they lost that game. They lost to a better team, right? That's just plain and simple.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that might be the best team in the NFC, with all due respect to the Dallas Cowboys. I think they're far more well-rounded, especially when they get Michael Bennett back. So not only are they good, Russell Wilson obviously healthy. You saw the fact that they knew his mobility was back by the fact they sent him out on that pattern with the misdirection and him catching the touchdown. So he's healthy. When Bennett gets back, Cam Chancellor's back. You saw his effect on the game. They're just a really, really well-rounded team. And then you add the fact that that's the most difficult place to play. It's a logical loss. So, unfortunately,
how much did the atmosphere yesterday help to in the loss? I mean, do you think that was a legitimate, like, if that game's in Philly, is it a different story?
Oh, sure. It's a much different story. The Eagles play much better at home, so they probably would have done a better job defensively. And I always talk about it. Forget about Seattle. In any road environment, it's much more difficult on the offense unless you're in a total, maybe Cleveland this time of year, you're totally in a moribund environment where nobody cares. Anytime you have that noise factor, you're a step slower because you have silent counts and you have to wait, and that affects everything from the pass blocking to the receivers getting into their patterns a tick slow, which obviously means a heck of a lot for this team. So anytime you're on the road, it's a difficult pill to swallow in the NFL, and it makes it only more difficult when you're in Seattle. We talk about ad nauseum how much success they've had at home since 2012. It's real. Doug Peterson used that exact terminology when describing the 12th man. It's real, and it certainly is.
Jon McMullen with us as we talk Eagles and Seahawks football. So, John, it's an Eagles holiday because PT, Paul Turner, coming to the active roster. What's the reasoning behind that signing to the 53-man roster, and how much does that have to do with Nelson Agholor's performance on Sunday?
It's an early Christmas gift from Doug Peterson to the fan base. They finally get what they want.
We're giving thanks this Thanksgiving by giving you Paul Turner.
No, I mean, obviously Nelson Agholor is a mess mentally, and he admitted it after the game. He finally admitted it. He's got to get out of his own way. And I've been saying for weeks the Eagles should shut him down just for the mere fact that he needs a break. He needs to get away from it. He needs to understand it's not life and death. He is just killing this team right now. And the fact that they keep rolling him out there, and he plays as much as he does, part of that speaks to just how bad the other receivers are on this team. But at some point, for his own good, as Doug kind of intimated today, you have to shut him down, even if it's just for a week or two, because he is just mentally shot. And very much similar, I compared it to Blair Walsh, the kicker in Minnesota. I mean, obviously, he's got some physical gifts. He can't catch the football. When he does, he struggles, and he's sort of fighting it. Now he's not lining up correctly. Look, the lack of production for him in the amount of playing time is historic. The fact that he just can't produce. I mean, people in this town dislike Riley Cooper. Compared to Nelson Agholor, Riley Cooper is Jerry Rice, the numbers he put up. I mean, it is astonishing how bad Nelson Agholor has been, and the Eagles can't keep trotting him out on the field.
Yeah, so there's a lot to dive into on this particular subject, obviously, because Agholor, all right, he comes out, he finally says, look, I'm mentally having some problems. I got to get out of my own head. When you hear that, then I ask the question, well, does Doug Peterson have too much on his plate that this is just coming out now, that he hasn't had a chance to sit down with this young man and say, Nelson, we're watching the tape, man. You're struggling on the tape. Is there something going on that we need to talk about? Like, do you look at Peterson and say that he allowed this to go on too long?
No, I don't. I mean, this is the NFL. And if you're, let's face it, if you're not mentally strong enough to deal with criticism, you don't belong in this league.
Right, but don't you think the fact that this guy's not catching the ball, he's constantly making mistakes, not blocking, he lines up wrong, that maybe someone
they would tell you differently. They tell that, according to them, the one thing he has done well is block. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's what the Eagles have been saying. I think the fact that they keep playing him has more to do with the fact that they don't like their other options, more than the fact they obviously know Nelson's not producing. He's obviously been told ad nauseum behind the scenes. You saw Greg Lewis on the sidelines just reading him the riot act. He's been getting all this, and that's part of it, because it is pointed out every week just how many mistakes he's making. Just the fact that, for instance, the week prior they had to waste a challenge on a 4-yard gain because he bobbled the football instead of just catching it cleanly like a receiver in this league should do. All of this is added to sort of the burden on his shoulders. It's not just the media pointing it out. It's not just the fan base pointing it out. The coaches certainly tell him what he hasn't been doing each and every week. And like I said, if he can't handle that, he probably doesn't belong in this league.
So does Agholor sit on Monday night, John, against the Packers?
I would think so. I never say 100%. Doug certainly alluded to the fact that that's at least a possibility. I've advocated them doing that for a number of weeks now, even if it's just for 1 week. And as I said, the only reason they haven't done it to this point is because they haven't liked the way Dorial Green Beckham is playing. Bryce Treggs is sort of a one-trick pony. Maybe now that they brought up Paul Turner, the savior for this organization, they can get somebody else out on the field. But at this point, it's not about who's out there. It's about taking him off, because I don't care who it is. You could bring somebody out on the street, from the street, and they're probably going to produce more than Nelson Agholor is right now.
You brought up DGB. Was all that late game DGB action them trying to see how much they can trust him? Maybe he gets those Agholor snaps moving forward?
Well, yeah, I would imagine he would, but I don't take any credence into those late garbage time numbers. I thought they were meaningless, and that was basically the entire Eagles passing game. So I throw that out. Understand, until Jordan Matthews caught a pass with about 12 minutes left in this game. Think about this, guys. Russell Wilson has as much receiving yardage as the Eagles receivers. Through 3+ quarters, Eagles receivers had 15 yards, and so did Russell Wilson on that throwback touchdown throw from Doug Baldwin. People say, why has Carson Wentz taken a step back? And, sometimes I battle with Teron Davenport. We'll have him on the show tomorrow. That Carson doesn't get criticized enough. Look, with this group, how does a rookie quarterback supposed to perform? It is astonishing just how unproductive they've been. And it just keeps getting worse every week.
I dug out names, John, like Chris T. Jones, going back into the archives of poor receivers in the past that maybe weren't as bad as these guys. So do you think Turner then gets a role, and a strong role, or is he just a seat filler, really?
Well, I think he's a seat filler at this point. I think if they do sit him, and that's if, he might be out there against Green Bay because they just don't feel good about their other options. You would have to think Green Beckham, at least by running a few slants and catching a few balls in the fourth quarter, that he would at least get more playing time. And we'll see how that shakes out. I think it's pretty evident. If they thought Paul Turner could help this team, he would have been up on this roster a lot earlier. This directly comes from the fact that Nelson Agholor basically, as I said, admitted after the game that he's a mental mess, and they're almost forced to do something.
Hey, John, do you think, I don't know how that Peterson described or explained not calling timeout, but do you think he should have called timeout on the play, on the touchdown play?
Well, hey, look, I don't think it was that big of a deal, but I will say this. You mentioned before, Mike, does he have too much on his plate? I often say, if you're a head coach in this league and you're calling plays, be it offensive or defensive, you have too much on your plate. It's as simple as that. And Doug, usually first-year head coaches all call plays because they want to, and they want to put their stamp on the organization. But we've seen it time and time again, as veteran coaches get more comfortable in their skin, they generally give up play calling because there's too much to do on the sidelines on game day. And you have to be involved in everything. And if you're thinking about the next play or what to call, obviously you're not thinking about the entire structure of the game, and that includes time management. And you're not an offensive coordinator. You're a head coach. You got to think about special teams. You got to think about defense. You got to think about situations, time management. So I say that about every single coach, not just Doug Peterson. But while I say that, I don't know of any first-time head coach that doesn't call his plays, whether he's an offensive or defensive guy. It's just something that's done in this league, and I really think it should be revisited, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. And if you have enough confidence in your ability, you should hire coaches that you are comfortable delegating to, who will implement your plan, and then you can sort of oversee the whole team on game day.
And Mike and I talked about that, John, that Doug Peterson's had to deal with, did Josh Huff bring a gun into the complex? Who was at a strip club in training camp? Who beat up a Cabana guy in Florida? There's been all kinds of off-the-field issues that he's had to deal with each week. And how do you think he's handled all those in addition to the responsibilities as being a head coach?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think he's done well with the off-field stuff. I think he's handled it as well as could be expected. But you bring up a good point, Pete. That stuff, that's also in the mix when you're a head coach. I mean, that's one thing Jim Schwartz loves. When people try to ask him questions as a former head coach, what do you think of this? He'll completely shut it down. And I think he's kind of happy with it. Not that he doesn't want to be a head coach again, but he doesn't have to address those type of issues. And if you're the head coach, you have to. You're the spokesperson of the team. You are the face of the franchise. And that's another example of what coaches have on their plate. And, I often said forget about Doug Peterson. If you go back to Chip, there you had an offensive play caller who was a head coach and a general manager. If you're talking about having too much on your plate, and you saw how it blew up on him. So I think as Doug gets, as I said, as he gets more comfortable in the skin, he's going to realize that relatively quickly, and I think you'll see things change over the years.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Jim Schwartz. We talk with John McMullen as we break down the Eagles and Seahawks game from yesterday. And Jim Schwartz, his defense was getting a lot of credit going into this game as being at the same level or in the same neighborhood as the Seahawks defense, and Seattle racks up 439 yards of total offense.
Yeah, well, I thought that was, statistically, you could say that because I think the Eagles were sixth coming into the game, and the Seahawks were ninth in total yardage. So they were actually ahead of them. Points per game, the Seahawks were second, the Eagles were third. So they belonged in the conversation from a statistical standpoint. But as we kind of pointed out, look, the Seahawks have been doing this for a long time. And the Eagles have taken a huge step forward this season. But, hey, they're a heck of a lot better at home than they are on the road. They haven't done as well. They still have some issues. You saw that Jalen Mills had a really, really poor game, giving up. I think they gave up 7 plays of 17 or more yards in the first half. So they were giving up big chunks, and Mills was responsible. But, you know, the cornerstones of this defense that we've been talking about all year, Brandon Graham specifically, Fletcher Cox, Jordan Hicks, they were all great. And so I think it's nothing, as far as the defensive side of the ball, I think it's nothing but good things. You just got to add some pieces. You need help at the cornerback position. There's no question about that.
No doubt about that. As we talk with John McMullen here. All right, let's go over the injury situation. Yesterday was a brutal game. They got beat up all over the place. Guys in and out of the game. Some guys hurt, but more than others. Let's start with Ryan Matthews. He's been a guy who's had all sorts of injury problems in his history. Doug seemed to say he was day to day. So it looks like Matthews could play and Sproles could both be back for Monday night.
Yeah, it looks definite for Sproles. That's a pain tolerance issue. He called the rib fracture. Doug said it was in a safe place. And, you know, as tough as Darren is, he's going to be out there. So I don't think there's any question that he's going to play against the Packers. With Ryan Matthews, though, you don't know because he doesn't have that type of history where he's going to drag himself on the field if he's not completely feeling 100%. So here we are through 10 games, and your bell cow back, or you're supposed to be bell cow back, has dealt with an ankle injury, a tooth infection. Now we have a knee injury. It's just more of the same with Ryan Matthews. And maybe because of where the Eagles sit and the fact that the other 3 NFC East teams won yesterday, maybe it's time to take a look at the rookie and just take the shrink wrap off and just make Wendell Smallwood your guy.
All right. How about it looks like you're going to see what a lot of people thought we would see before, which is Barber at right tackle, Wisniewski at left guard, because it looks like Big V is going to be a week-to-week proposition now.
Yeah, and that means he's going to be out for a number of weeks. Anytime Doug uses that terminology, that's the way it's gone. We saw it with Zach Ertz. Earlier in the season, he used week to week. We saw it with Alan Barber most recently. He was out. So there's no question Vaitai not going to play against the Packers. And by the way, how about Alan Barber? You got to give that guy a lot of credit. He played 3 different positions yesterday. Obviously, he started left guard. Jason Peters leaves early with the forearm injury. He goes out to left tackle. Peters comes back. Vaitai goes down, and he kicks out the right tackle. And really, he held up pretty well. The offensive line wasn't terrible against the Seahawks, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that Alan Barber is so versatile, and he was able to hold down the fort.
Yeah, it was, pretty amazing because you see him bouncing out the left side, then he had to go play the right side at some point. So a lot of stuff on the injury. So Big V out as well. We also saw concussion for
Leotis
McKelvin. We've got Connor Barwin with a bone bruise. But those were the main ones. We got Matthews, Sproles, McKelvin, Vaitai. Yesterday, Peters left the game, came back in the game. Seemingly, he's okay because he wasn't brought up at all today. Zach Ertz, Terrence Brooks, and Brent Selleck with the ribs. So they got beat up. Fletcher Cox left. That was a physical game for them. But, John, they come back home Monday night. We'll talk more about that game and everything coming up tomorrow. We'll look back over the NFL. We'll all be at Chickies and Pete's tomorrow in Egg Harbor Township when we do our Tuesday football show, and we're looking forward to that. So we'll dive a lot deeper into the NFL, which, as you just mentioned, all the NFC East teams won, John, which has now made the Eagles' path to even thinking about being that second playoff team even more difficult because now you're at a spot where even if you win your games in the division, you need someone else to help you now because you've now fallen 2 games behind the mix instead of that 1 game you were because they all won and you lost.
Yeah, the margin for error is very small. I mean, but it already was. If you think about the 0-3 record in the division, that meant the Eagles, hey, they gotta win every single home game in the division. They really got to win out at home the rest of the season, and they probably are going to need a game. But realize the Redskins, the Giants, the Cowboys, they'll also be playing each other. Redskins play the Cowboys next week. Somebody's got to lose.
Thanksgiving Day.
On Thanksgiving, actually. And you mentioned, I think, last week, Mike, you looked at the Giants' schedule. It gets a lot tougher down the stretch, and I've been saying for weeks, I don't know how that team wins. They keep winning, but they don't look impressive doing it. So that's the one team I look at and say, maybe at some point they're going to come down to earth.
All right, we'll dive into plenty NFC tomorrow, playoff possibilities, and, of course, who's in, who's out. Teron Davenport, Mike Tirico, busy show tomorrow. We will be, John, at the EHT location, so you can join us over there tomorrow.
All right, guys, looking forward to it.